The fall air outside my window was still, almost unnervingly so. I'd always found solace in autumn. The rich golds and reds, the smell of leaves, and that little nip in the wind. But that night something felt off. The stillness wasn't serene. It was oppressive, like the silence was holding its breath, waiting. I'd been house-sitting for a friend while they took a much-needed vacation. It was a remote place, a 2-story house perched on the edge of a cliff. The view overlooked a vast expanse of trees, rolling hills, and somewhere far off, the faint outline of the city skyline. Peaceful during the day. At night, not so much. That evening, I decided to test the nerves I didn't think I had and started a true crime documentary binge. Typical, right? Alone in a big house in the middle of nowhere. The worst thing you could do is fill your head with nightmare fuel. But hey, boredom does strange things. Around 11 p.m., I paused the show to grab a drink. Heading to the kitchen, I noticed something weird. The porch light was flickering. I figured it was a loose bulb, a harmless quirk of an old house. Grabbing a step stool, I went outside to fix it. The air out there was colder than I'd expected, biting into my skin even through my sweater. I looked up at the bulb. It wasn't loose. Instead, there was a handprint smeared across the glass. I froze. The handprint wasn't faint. It was clear, like someone had pressed their palm firmly against the bulb's surface. Smudges of what looked like dirt? Or was it something else? Trailed down the glass. I glanced around the yard, the dense trees encircling the property suddenly seeming closer, darker. My breath puffed in front of me, the cold wrapping around my chest like an icy fist. My rational brain fought to take control. Maybe the gardener had left it there, or maybe my friend before they left, but deep down I knew neither made sense. The bulb was high up, requiring a step stool to even reach it. The yard was empty, the house behind me silent. I tightened my grip on the step stool, my gaze darting from shadow to shadow, every rustle of leaves suddenly deafening. Get a grip, I muttered under my breath. I wiped the bulb clean with my sleeve and retreated inside, bolting the door behind me. For the next hour, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe even my own handprint, smeared on there when I installed the bulb earlier in the week. Sure, that's it. But the nagging sensation that someone had been there wouldn't let me relax. Around midnight, I was on the couch scrolling mindlessly through my phone, the TV a comforting murmur in the background. That's when I heard it. 3 deliberate knocks on the back door. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The door was glass-paned, with a curtain drawn across it. Beyond that was the deck and the thick woods just beyond. Who the hell would be out there at this hour? Hello, I called, immediately regretting it. My voice sounded shaky, foreign in the heavy silence. The knocks came again, louder this time, sharper. I crept to the door, every nerve in my body screaming not to. I pulled the curtain aside just an inch. Nothing. No one was there. The deck was empty, bathed in pale moonlight. I stared out at the trees, their branches skeletal against the night sky. My heart was racing now, every beat echoing in my ears. Then I noticed it, the condensation on the glass. It had a pattern, like someone had been breathing heavily against the door just moments before. I stumbled back from the door, my pulse hammering. Someone or something had been standing there, watching, breathing. My first instinct was to call the police, but I hesitated. What would I even say? Hey, there's breath on my glass door, but no one's there? They'd think I was crazy. Gripping my phone tightly, I turned on the flashlight and swung it toward the yard. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees and the empty lawn. Empty. Too empty. I realized I hadn't even heard the usual nighttime sounds. No crickets, no wind, not even the occasional owl. Just nothing. I closed the curtain, double-checked the locks, and backed away. Every step felt heavier, like the air was thickening around me. The house, once cozy and quiet, now felt cavernous and alien. I decided to retreat upstairs. The second floor had fewer windows and a locked door leading to the balcony. Safer. Or at least it felt that way. I climbed the stairs slowly, every creak of the wood beneath my feet sounding like a gunshot. When I reached the bedroom, I locked the door behind me, dragging a heavy chair against it for good measure. I sat on the bed, clutching my phone, and tried to convince myself it was over. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe I'd imagined the handprint and the breath. My heart finally started to slow. That's when I heard it. A soft tapping sound. It wasn't coming from downstairs this time. It was closer, much closer. I turned toward the bedroom window. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. The curtain was drawn, but I could see the faint silhouette of something, or someone, behind it. Summoning every ounce of courage I didn't have, I stood and crept toward the window. My hand trembled as I gripped the edge of the curtain, ready to yank it aside. And then the tapping stopped. Silence. I held my breath, frozen in place, and then a face appeared, pressed hard against the glass. The face wasn't human. Its eyes were too large, bulging and unblinking, with pupils like pinpricks. The skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched taut over a bony skull. Its mouth was impossibly wide, lips curled back to reveal jagged teeth that gleamed in the dim moonlight. And it was smiling. I stumbled back, my heart slamming against my ribs. The thing didn't move. It just stared, its breath fogging up the glass in rhythmic bursts. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it a mask? A trick of the light? But no. The way it moved, the way its features twitched and shifted, it was alive. My survival instincts kicked in and I bolted for the door. As I fumbled with the lock, I heard the sharp, deliberate sound of nails or claws scraping against the window. I glanced back just in time to see the thing tilt its head, its smile growing wider, impossibly so. The lock finally gave way, and I threw the door open, darting into the hallway. I slammed the bedroom door shut behind me and shoved the chair back against it. My phone was still in my hand, and I fumbled to call 911. 911? What's your emergency? The operator asked. There's someone outside, I stammered. They're trying to get in. Please, send someone. Quickly, I gave them the address, my voice cracking as I spoke. Officers are on their way, the operator assured me. Stay on the line with me. Are you in a safe place? A loud crash cut me off. The bedroom window. The thing had smashed through it. My blood ran cold as I heard it. A low, guttural growl, followed by the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor. It was in the house. Couldn't breathe. The sound of it moving, those deliberate dragging steps, was getting closer. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but my survival instincts screamed louder. I took off down the hallway, my phone still clutched in my trembling hand. Are you there? The 911 operator's voice echoed faintly, a lifeline in the chaos. It's inside, I whispered. It's in the house. Stay calm. Find a place to hide and lock yourself in if you can. Hide, right? But where? The hallway stretched ahead of me, doors on either side. Each felt like a gamble, but standing there was worse. My feet carried me to a small closet at the end of the hall. I slipped inside, easing the door shut behind me. The air was stale and thick, filled with the faint scent of mothballs. I crouched low, trying to quiet my breathing. Outside, the sounds grew louder, the dragging, the growling. It was searching. Officers are 3 minutes out, the operator said. Stay quiet and don't move. I wanted to believe that 3 minutes would save me, but it felt like an eternity. Then the sound stopped. The dragging, the growling, everything. The silence was worse. It stretched on, oppressive and heavy. I strained to listen, every muscle in my body tense. Was it gone? Had it moved to another part of the house? The closet door creaked. My blood turned to ice as I saw it. A thin, bony finger curling around the edge of the door. Slowly, the door inched open, and there it was. Its face was inches from mine, those unblinking eyes staring straight into me. That same horrifying smile stretched impossibly wide, its teeth gleaming in the dim light. Couldn't move, couldn't scream. It tilted its head as if studying me. Then, in a voice that was low and guttural, yet disturbingly clear, it whispered, "Found you." My body went cold. Found you. Those two words hung in the air like a death sentence. Its voice was wrong, grating and wet, like the sound of rocks grinding underwater. Before I could even process what was happening, it lunged. My survival instincts took over, and I kicked out with everything I had. My foot connected with its chest or whatever it was made of. The thing stumbled back, letting out a sound somewhere between a snarl and a laugh. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I bolted out of the closet, down the hallway, and toward the stairs. My only thought was escape. The thing followed, its footsteps now pounding, faster, heavier. As I reached the stairs, my phone buzzed with a faint crackle. "Officers are outside," the operator said, but her voice sounded distant, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. I flew down the steps, nearly slipping as I hit the landing. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it behind me, its presence like a shadow that was too close, too wrong. The front door was just ahead. I grabbed the handle, yanked it open, and stumbled into the night. Red and blue lights flashed across the yard. 2 police officers were approaching, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Relief washed over me in a wave so powerful I almost collapsed. "It's inside," I screamed. "It's in the house." The officers exchanged a glance, their hands moving to their holsters. One of them motioned for me to stay put while the other moved toward the door. But then I heard it. A low, guttural laugh echoed from the house. The officer at the door stopped in his tracks, his flashlight trembling. "What the hell?" he muttered, stepping back. The thing appeared in the doorway. Its smile was gone now, replaced by a snarl that exposed too many teeth. It crouched low, its long fingers curling against the frame of the door like a spider ready to pounce. "Stay back," one of the officers yelled, drawing his weapon. The thing tilted its head again, as if amused, before it moved. Fast. It launched itself toward them, faster than I thought possible. The first officer fired, the shots deafening in the quiet night, but the thing didn't stop. It hit him like a freight train, sending him sprawling to the ground. I stumbled back, my legs threatening to give out. The second officer fired, but the thing was already moving, darting toward the trees at the edge of the property. It disappeared into the darkness, leaving only silence in its wake. The officers scrambled to their feet, their faces pale and stricken. "What the hell was that?" one of them asked, his voice shaking. I don't know," the other stammered, glancing toward the trees. I didn't have answers. I didn't have words. All I knew was that it was still out there, watching. To this day, I don't know what I saw. The police wrote it off as a wild animal incident, though none of their reports ever mentioned the thing's face. My friend's house was put up for sale the very next week, and I haven't been back since. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I swear I can hear it, that low, wet laugh. And when I do, I keep every light in the house on and pray that it's just my imagination. Because if it's not, it's only a matter of time before it finds me again. The thing vanished into the trees, but the air felt wrong, heavy. It didn't feel like it had truly left. The officers stood frozen, their weapons trembling in their hands. I tried to steady my breathing, but it came in short, panicked gasps. One of the officers turned to me, his face pale. "You're coming with us," he said, his voice sharp but tinged with fear. "We can't leave you here." I nodded, unable to speak, and followed them toward their patrol car. As I climbed into the back seat, I kept glancing at the edge of the forest, half expecting those pale eyes and twisted grin to emerge again. We sped down the long, winding driveway, the headlights carving through the oppressive darkness. The officer driving kept glancing at the rearview mirror, his hand gripping the wheel tightly. The other was on the radio calling for backup. And then the car stopped. The engine was still running, but the headlights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the trees. "What the hell now?" the driver muttered, slamming the dashboard. The radio crackled, the static loud and piercing. "All units. Unnown ent. Tie repeat." The words were garbled, breaking up in a wash of static and faint voices. "What's happening?" I asked, my voice shaking. Before anyone could answer, a loud thud hit the roof of the car, denting it inward. "Stay inside," the officer in the passenger seat barked as he threw open the door, his weapon drawn. I stayed frozen, clutching my phone like it was a lifeline. Another thud, heavier this time, shook the car. I craned my neck, trying to see what was on the roof, but the officers were yelling, their voices overlapping in panic. And then, in the faint glow of the flickering headlights, I saw it. A pale hand, long, skeletal, and impossibly thin, slid down the windshield. Its fingers splayed across the glass, leaving streaks of something dark and wet. "Get out of the car," one of the officers shouted, yanking the back door open and grabbing my arm. I stumbled out, my legs nearly giving way beneath me. As the officer pulled me away from the car, I saw the thing leap from the roof, its movements unnaturally fast and fluid. It disappeared into the woods again, but the damage was done. The car was totaled, the roof caved in, the windows cracked. And the officers? They looked like they'd aged 10 years in mere minutes. "We need to move," the driver said, his voice barely above a whisper. Now, the forest loomed ahead of us, thick and suffocating. Every branch seemed to twist into grotesque shapes in the flickering glow of the broken headlights. The officers whispered in hurried tones, their movements jerky, as if every shadow held the promise of doom. I wanted to run. Every instinct in me screamed to bolt, to leave the patrol car and its ruined safety behind. But where would I go? The house was miles away, and the creature, it was somewhere out there, waiting. "Backup still on its way," one of the officers muttered, his voice barely steady. "We just have to hold tight." "Hold tight," the other snapped. "You saw what it did to the car, Frank. We're sitting ducks out here." A loud snap echoed from the woods, cutting their argument short. We all turned toward the sound. Another snap, closer this time, followed by the rustle of leaves. "It's circling us," the driver whispered, his hand tightening on his gun. The silence that followed was so thick, I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. The flashlight beams swept across the trees, but they revealed nothing. And then, out of nowhere, a sound erupted, a wet, gurgling laugh. It echoed from every direction, bouncing off the trees, surrounding us. My legs felt like jelly as I backed toward the patrol car, my eyes darting to every shadow. The laugh grew louder, more guttural, as if it was feeding on our fear. "Stay together," one officer barked, his voice cracking, but it was too late. Something shot out of the darkness so fast it was a blur. It hit the driver, slamming him to the ground with a sickening crunch. His scream was cut short, replaced by a choking sound as the thing loomed over him, its limbs impossibly long, its face twisted into that horrifying grin. The other officer fired, the gunshots deafening in the still night. The thing reared back, its movements jerky, unnatural. The driver's body slumped to the ground, unmoving. "Run!" the remaining officer shouted, grabbing my arm. We tore through the woods, branches whipping against my face, the ground uneven and treacherous beneath my feet. Behind us, I could hear it. Those pounding, dragging footsteps, the guttural growls that grew louder with each passing second. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but I didn't stop. The officer stayed close, his flashlight beam bobbing wildly as we ran. "There's a service road up ahead," he panted. "If we can make it, we—" He never finished. The creature came out of nowhere, slamming into him with the force of a truck. His flashlight hit the ground, its beam spinning wildly before going out. I turned just in time to see the thing's pale, skeletal hands wrapping around his throat, its grin widening as it squeezed. I wanted to help, but my body refused to move. And then, it looked at me, its eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. That unblinking stare bore into me, freezing my blood, pinning me in place. The officer's lifeless body crumpled to the ground, and the thing tilted its head, studying me like a predator sizing up its prey. My legs felt like they weighed a ton, but sheer panic propelled me forward. I turned and bolted, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest closed in around me, branches clawing at my face and arms, but I didn't dare slow down. Behind me, I could hear it following. Its movements were erratic, each step a mix of dragging and scuttling, accompanied by that awful wet, gurgling laugh. It wasn't running, not exactly, but it was fast. Too fast. The service road had to be close. The officer had said it was nearby, but in the chaos, every tree looked the same. The darkness pressed in on all sides, and I stumbled over roots and rocks, barely able to keep my footing. Then I saw it. A faint glow through the trees, a streetlight, the service road. Hope surged through me, giving me one last burst of energy. I pushed myself harder, the light growing closer with every step. The thing was still behind me, its presence an oppressive force that I could feel pressing against my back. I broke through the tree line, stumbling onto the gravel road. The streetlight cast a dim, flickering glow, but it was enough to see the narrow road stretching into the distance. Farther down, headlights appeared, a vehicle approaching. "Help!" I screamed, waving my arms frantically. "Please, help me!" The vehicle slowed, its beams cutting through the night. It was another patrol car. 2 officers stepped out, their faces etched with confusion and concern. "What's going on?" one of them asked, his hand hovering over his holstered gun. "It's coming," I cried, pointing toward the woods. "You have to." A deafening crash interrupted me. The thing burst out of the trees, its pale, gangly form illuminated in the headlights. The officers drew their weapons, their expressions shifting from confusion to pure terror. "Get behind us," one of them barked, raising his gun. The creature stopped, crouching low, its grin stretching wider. It tilted its head again, that awful laugh bubbling up from deep within its throat. The officers opened fire, the gunshots echoing in the night. The thing moved with impossible speed, dodging and weaving as it closed the distance between us. One officer screamed as it grabbed him, its claws sinking into his shoulder. The second officer kept firing, but the thing didn't even flinch. This was it. I was going to die here. But then, something strange happened. The headlights of the patrol car began to flicker wildly, and the air grew heavy, charged with static. The creature stopped, its head snapping toward the car as if distracted. It let out a guttural growl, releasing the officer and backing away slowly. The light around it seemed to warp, distorting its form. Its grin faltered for the first time, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. And then, without warning, it vanished. The silence that followed was deafening. The officers and I stood frozen, the air around us still buzzing with an unnatural energy. The thing was gone, or at least it wasn't visible anymore, but the oppressive weight it left behind hadn't lifted. What the hell was that?" One of the officers choked out, his voice barely audible over the ringing in my ears. I didn't answer. How could I? I didn't even know where to begin. The injured officer groaned, slumping against the patrol car. His partner rushed to his side, pulling out his radio to call for backup. "Officer down. We need medical assistance at the service road near." The radio crackled, cutting him off. "Noun ent. Ty advis." The same garbled transmission I'd heard earlier came through again. Only this time it was louder, clearer. The static swelled, growing louder and more erratic. I clamped my hands over my ears, the sound piercing and shrill. The officer holding the radio dropped it, his face twisting in pain. And then the headlights flickered again. The patrol car's engine sputtered, its lights dimming and brightening in quick, frantic bursts. The air grew heavier, thicker, as if we were being swallowed by the night itself. "No," I whispered, stepping back. "No, no, no." A low hum began to resonate, vibrating through the ground beneath us. It felt like the earth itself was trembling, an ominous rhythm that grew louder with each passing second. The remaining officer grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "We have to move. Now." "Where?" I croaked. "It's everywhere." But he didn't answer. He hoisted his injured partner into the patrol car, motioning for me to get in. I hesitated, my gaze fixed on the treeline. I could feel it, feel them. The thing wasn't alone. The shadows between the trees shifted, moving unnaturally, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw multiple sets of eyes. Pale, glowing, unblinking, watching. The officer's shout snapped me back to reality. "Get in!" I dove into the backseat just as the patrol car roared to life. The engine whined in protest, but it held, and we sped down the road, the flickering headlights cutting through the encroaching darkness. I dared to glance back. The trees lining the road seemed to writhe, their branches reaching toward us like skeletal hands. And in the distance, standing at the edge of the woods, was the thing. It didn't move. It just stood there watching us. But it wasn't smiling anymore. The patrol car tore down the service road, the wheels spitting gravel in its wake. Inside, the air was thick with tension, the faint smell of burnt rubber mingling with the metallic tang of fear. The injured officer groaned in the front seat, clutching his torn shoulder, his face pale and slick with sweat. I sat in the back, my eyes locked on the road ahead, but my mind was racing. Those things weren't just stalking us. They were playing with us, drawing us into some kind of trap. The officer driving glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his eyes wild. We're heading back to the station. Whatever the hell that was, we need reinforcements, SWAT, National Guard, something. But I knew it wasn't that simple. Deep down, I could feel it. This wasn't something you could fight with guns or numbers. This was different. The radio crackled again, breaking through my thoughts. Own in tit, Proxim. The static grew louder, almost deafening, before cutting out completely. And then the car's headlights went out. The darkness was immediate and absolute, swallowing the car and the road in an instant. The engine sputtered, and the patrol car lurched to a stop, the sudden silence as suffocating as the night around us. "No, no, no!" the driver shouted, slamming his fist against the dashboard. He turned the key, but the engine refused to start. The injured officer moaned, his head lolling to the side. "It's here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The driver grabbed his flashlight, his hands shaking. "Stay in the car," he barked at me before stepping out, the door creaking like a scream in the still night. I pressed myself against the seat, gripping my phone like it was a lifeline. My heart was pounding so hard, it felt like it might burst. And then I heard it, a faint scraping sound, like nails on metal, coming from the roof of the car. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The driver's flashlight beam swept across the road, but it didn't reach far. He turned, his light aimed at the roof, and that's when it happened. The roof caved in with a deafening crash, and something slammed onto the hood of the car. I couldn't see it clearly, but its silhouette was wrong. Twisted and angular, with too many limbs and a head that cocked unnaturally to the side. The officer screamed, firing his weapon, but the thing moved too fast. It was on him in an instant, its claws raking across his chest. I didn't think. I just moved. I threw open the door on the other side and bolted into the woods, my feet pounding against the earth. Behind me, the officer's screams were abruptly cut off, replaced by that awful, gurgling laugh. The forest swallowed me whole, its shadows stretching and twisting as I ran. Branches clawed at my arms and face, and my lungs burned, but I didn't dare stop. Somewhere behind me, I could hear it, the dragging footsteps, the growl, and then up ahead I saw it. A light. It was faint, barely more than a flicker, but it was there. I stumbled toward it, hope surging in my chest. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The light wasn't coming from a house or a street lamp. It was floating, a small, glowing orb, pulsing gently like a heartbeat. I stopped in my tracks, my chest heaving. The orb hovered there, almost invitingly, its glow casting eerie shadows across the trees. And then, from the darkness around it, I saw them. More figures, more eyes, more grins. They emerged from the trees, their pale forms gliding toward me, surrounding me. I was trapped. The glowing orb pulsed, its light throbbing in time with the panicked beat of my heart. The figures moved closer, their movements deliberate, almost synchronized. Each one was different. Some with stretched limbs, others hunched and jagged, but their eyes were the same. Wide, unblinking, and impossibly hollow. And those grins. God, those grins. I backed away, my foot catching on a root. I fell hard. The air punched out of my lungs, but I couldn't look away. The orb seemed to grow brighter, its light washing over the clearing, and in its glow, I could see the figures more clearly. Their skin wasn't just pale, it was translucent, veins and tendons visible beneath the surface. Their bodies twitched with unnatural spasms, like marionettes pulled by an unseen force. And then they spoke. Not with words, but with sound. A chorus of guttural growls, wet laughter, and faint whispers filled the air, weaving together into something almost melodic. It wasn't human. It wasn't meant to be heard by human ears. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was in my head, vibrating through my skull, growing louder and louder until it was all I could hear. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the noise. The orb pulsed again and the figures stopped. Their heads turned toward the light in unison, their grins fading. For a moment, everything was still, and then, one by one, they began to dissolve. Their forms broke apart like smoke, wisps of their bodies drawn toward the orb. It absorbed them, its glow intensifying with each one, until the clearing was empty save for me and the light. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. The orb pulsed again, brighter this time, and then it spoke. Stay. The voice wasn't like the others. It was deep, resonant, and impossibly calm. Stay, it said again, the word vibrating through me like a command. No, I whispered, my voice barely audible. The orb pulsed, and suddenly, the ground beneath me shifted. Roots twisted and coiled, wrapping around my ankles and wrists, pulling me toward the light. I thrashed, trying to free myself, but the roots were relentless. They pulled tighter, dragging me closer, the orb's glow now blinding. Stay, the voice repeated, louder this time, more insistent. No, I screamed, fighting with everything I had. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it, a flicker of blue and red lights, cutting through the trees. Back up. The orb hesitated, its light flickering for the first time. The roots loosened their grip, just enough for me to break free. I scrambled to my feet, stumbling toward the approaching lights. Behind me, the orb's glow dimmed, and the voice echoed one last time, low and menacing. We'll meet again. I didn't look back. The backup officers found me on the edge of the forest, trembling and covered in scratches. They didn't believe my story, of course. How could they? But they couldn't explain the state of the other patrol car, or the officers who were never found. I left the area the next morning, vowing never to return. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I swear I can still feel the pulse of that light, hear the echo of that word. Stay. For weeks after that night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the orb, felt the cold, unrelenting pull of those roots, and heard that single haunting word. Stay. I left the area, as far from the house and that forest as I could manage. But distance didn't help. The nightmares came anyway, and when I was awake, the world felt off. Shadows seemed darker, longer, as if they were watching me. Lights flickered more often, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even in crowded spaces. I started noticing other things, too. Little things, like the man at the bus stop who stared too long, his face unreadable, or the woman in the grocery store whose movements were just a little too mechanical. And then one evening I found a package at my door. It wasn't labeled, just a plain brown box. My heart sank as I stared at it. I hadn't ordered anything, and I sure as hell didn't know who would send me something. Against my better judgment, I brought it inside. The box was surprisingly light, as if it was empty, but when I opened it, a single object lay inside. A light bulb, not just any bulb. It was the exact same model I'd replaced on the porch light the night this all started. My hands trembled as I picked it up. A faint smear of something dark and greasy streaked across the glass. A handprint. I dropped it, the bulb shattering into pieces, but the air around me suddenly felt colder, heavier. The lights in my apartment flickered. Once, twice, and then everything went dark. In the silence, I heard it. Faint, wet laugh. I spun around, my phone's flashlight trembling in my hand. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the window, and there it was, that face, those bulging, unblinking eyes, that impossible grin. It didn't tap this time. It didn't have to. Stay, the voice echoed, not from the window, but from behind me. I turned, and the light revealed nothing. just the empty room. But the voice came again, closer now, wrapping around me like a noose. "We'll meet again." The lights flickered back on, and the room was empty. The face at the window was gone. But I knew it wasn't over. It was never over. The days that followed blurred into an endless haze of paranoia. I stopped going to work, skipped meals, and barely slept. The thought that it could appear at any moment gnawed at the edges of my sanity. Every night, I triple-checked the locks on my doors and windows. Every shadow in the corners of my apartment felt alive, shifting when I wasn't looking. But the worst part? The whispers. They started faint, like a breeze carrying a sound too quiet to catch. Then they grew louder, clearer. It wasn't just the word "stay" anymore. They were saying my name, softly at first, then insistent, almost pleading. I started hearing it everywhere, in the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of floorboards, even in the hiss of the shower. "Come back," they whispered. "Come back to us." I wanted to ignore them. I wanted to convince myself I was losing my mind. But deep down, I knew the truth. They wouldn't stop until I returned. That night, I made a decision. If this was going to end, I had to face it. I packed a bag, flashlights, batteries, a crowbar, and a knife. It felt laughable, bringing weapons against something so unreal. But it was all I had. The drive back to the house was a blur, the headlights cutting through the endless stretch of dark, empty road. The further I drove, the heavier the air became, pressing down on my chest. The trees loomed taller, their branches curling like claws against the night sky. When I reached the house, it was exactly as I'd left it. Empty, silent, waiting. I stepped out of the car, my flashlight slicing through the darkness. The porch light, the one that had started it all, was dark now, its bulb shattered. The glass shards glinted faintly in the beam of my light. The whispers grew louder as I approached the door, their voices overlapping, pleading. "Come back. Stay." I pushed the door open, its creak echoing into the emptiness. The house smelled stale, like wood left to rot. Dust motes floated in the air, disturbed only by the beam of my flashlight. I moved through the house slowly, my footsteps deliberate, every creak of the floorboards making me flinch. And then I saw it. The orb. It hovered in the living room, just like before, its light pulsing softly. The glow painted the walls with shifting shadows, the edges of the room blurring as if reality itself was bending. "Come," the voice said, deep and resonant. I tightened my grip on the crowbar, stepping closer. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The orb pulsed, its light growing brighter. Around me, the shadows began to twist, pulling away from the walls and floor. They took shape, forming long, skeletal figures with grins too wide and eyes too empty. "Stay," they whispered in unison. "No!" I shouted, swinging the crowbar at the orb. It was like hitting air. The crowbar passed through the light without resistance, but the orb flickered, its glow dimming for a split second. The figures hissed, their forms distorting, but they didn't retreat. "Come back," the voice commanded, louder this time. The figures closed in, their hands outstretched, skeletal fingers reaching for me. Panic surged, and I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the shattered bulb from my bag, the one I'd brought from my apartment, and hurled it into the orb. The glass shattered against the light, and for a moment, everything went still. And then the orb exploded. A blinding flash consumed the room, and I was thrown backward, slamming into the wall. The light burned through my eyelids, and the sound, a deafening roar, filled every corner of my mind. When I opened my eyes, the room was empty. The orb, the figures, the whispers gone. The house was silent. I stumbled outside, gasping for air, the night sky above me impossibly clear. It was over, or so I thought. I sat on the porch of the house, the cold night air biting at my skin as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. My body ached, every muscle trembling with exhaustion, but the silence around me was almost comforting. The orb was gone. The house was still. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. But as I climbed into my car, a nagging thought lingered in the back of my mind. What had I done? Destroying the orb felt like an ending, but it also